Welcome back, y'all. Okay, it is 2 days before Christmas. I know the holidays can be especially tough if you are in the middle of considering divorce. So, I wanted this week's episode to hopefully be one where I get to really kind of pull you in close, wrap you in a big sister hug, and also be like, fuck that shit. In my big sister way. I'm really going to hopefully bring both the warmth and the honesty this week around what you may be struggling with during the holidays when you are considering divorce. So, to kick us off, I wanted to share my own personal story that I have from my process. Went back when I was considering divorce. I'm pretty sure it was the last Christmas I had with my in-laws. And y'all, I had forgotten about this story until reading my journals over the last couple months. And when I found it again, I was like, oh man, that was a brutal, brutal Christmas. So what had happened is we traveled to go see the in-laws for Christmas. We were there with all of my husband's family, all of the siblings, all of the nephews, nieces, and at that time I had, this was December of, I believe, 2018. So I'd spent that whole year like in the depths of deep personal work, realizing ultimately, like, hey, Mormonism's really not a fit for me. There's a lot of stuff in this religion that goes against some of the things I actually feel now very deeply about. I can see some of the toxicity, but that was still very held very close to my heart. It was something I wasn't sharing, especially not with really my family and, not with my in-laws. And so we're all there. I believe it was maybe even after we'd opened presents on Christmas Day, or maybe it was Christmas Eve. But my now ex-husband, but husband at the time, decided to disclose that I wasn't going to church anymore. And basically, that I was like, not, he didn't put it in these terms, but struggling with my faith. Like I was having questions about the church. Oh my God, y'all. That turned into a 2 hour long, I wouldn't, I'm going to put it in air quotes, intervention almost of just all of these questions from his family. I absolutely believe, deep down they were well meaning. I think they were trying to help, but ultimately, looking back, it was one of the most painful, stressful, overwhelmed, feeling betrayed, feeling way exposed. I couldn't process it in the moment because, I'd been kind of growing up trained by my mother to interact in that way, where everything gets to be on the table and your family gets to have access to every part of your life. And so, of course, they're going to talk with you about this. And of course, they're going to assume that they get to ask you whatever questions they want to ask. And it wouldn't be till, I would say weeks and months later, looking back on it, that I would be able to acknowledge how exposed I had felt and what a betrayal of my trust that had been in that moment of my husband, even if it was well meaning, sharing something that at that moment was personal to me and something I was not ready to share with the rest of the family. So, this is some of the stuff that many of us may be facing when we are going back into environments with perhaps family dynamics that we grew up in that are still rather unhealthy, right? Families that think it's everybody's business to know everything about everybody and don't really understand boundaries. So, at the time that happened, I'd been doing a good amount of work in therapy up till that point around my own family, but that was a level I wasn't prepared for when it came to having to hold a boundary with my in-laws. It was also a boundary I didn't expect to be crossed, so I wasn't that prepared to handle it when it happened. And I really didn't know how to so respectfully and just gracefully protect myself or stop the conversation. And I really wish I'd known what I do now, and which is going to be my biggest message for you all today, is that I didn't owe anyone any answers. That is the heart of this episode, is realizing where many of us grew up in dynamics where our individuation, our ability to have stuff that's just our own, that was kind of taken from us. And now as adults, we have to remind ourselves that you do not owe anyone answers. It is not your job to make everybody else comfortable with your life choices. I did not know that at that time. I was still, it was early in the process for me. And I really felt the weight and the burden of, in that conversation, right? You could feel everybody else's fear for me. That wasn't necessarily my fear, but their fear for me that then got projected onto me. And I took on the role of having to explain and caretake and hopefully give them answers to assuage their fear. Didn't realize at the time that's what I was doing, but looking back now, that's exactly what I was doing. And I didn't also understand now, God, we're like 7 years out from that. I can look back and I can see very clearly now how family conversations like that even though they may be coming from a space of like those people thinking they love you or it's well-intentioned on their part, I now know clearly that conversations like that are not supportive. When you are in a dynamic with someone who is afraid or has, in this instance, the church was very supportive for them. In my instance, it wasn't. So already out of the gate, they're feeling the need to convince or to try and push me back towards something that they feel is good for them, not understanding that it's not good for me. In those moments, y'all, that is just it's not supportive. These are not the conversations that we need to be having in family gatherings. And they may be the very conversations that certain members of our family are like eager to have with us during these times of the year. So in this episode, I am going to first discuss how people-pleasing and codependency tend to show up for many of us during the holidays. I want to give you some examples, just like this one. This is our first example to kick us off, sharing, how other people coming in, wanting to talk to me in my people-pleasing and codependency, I allowed those conversations. I actually engaged in those conversations when I could have shut them down. So we're going to talk about how people-pleasing and codependency show up around the holidays. Then we're going to come back to that core message. I just, glimpsed with you guys the I don't owe anyone answers about my life. We're going to spend some time there. And then we're going to end with a couple sections talking specifically about how I want you to tend your nervous system during the holidays and some practical support strategies for you that I would have really appreciated when I was going through this process as well. And I mean, here's the other big caveat to start this episode off. I'm going to give you strategies. I'm going to give you ways to think about and hopefully structure your journey through the holidays this year, through your Christmas, through your New Year's. But I also want you to be super gentle with yourselves. So just like I was saying, I knew I'd been going to therapy for almost 2 years by the time that conversation happened with my in-laws at Christmas. And still, it was too big of an ask in that moment, mainly because I was not expecting my husband to share that. I'd had like no internal mental prep. In my wildest dreams, I would not have thought that was what he was going to bring up at Christmas, that he was going to share that detail. And so I give myself a lot of compassion and grace. I'm not like shaming myself or upset with myself that I wasn't able to do that back then. In fact, I just feel like, oh, come here, sweetie pie. I got you. I just have a lot of respect that I even made it through that. So, although I'm going to give you these examples, be gentle with yourselves. Everybody, we're all at our different stages of the journey with healing around people pleasing, with learning to really, I think what often happens when we're faced with something like that, it feels like death. It feels like, oh my God, if I say no to these people or if I step away, that, especially if we were raised with conditional love, that's going to lead to them taking the love away. And as a child, that meant death. And as an adult, it's learning steadily, bit by bit, as you continue to have moments where you say, no, I'm not going to abandon myself to make you feel better. You start learning over and over, oh, I feel afraid right now, but I'm actually not in any danger. These people can't do anything to me. In that moment, I could have said, I'm not comfortable talking about this. And I could have left the room and there's nothing my in-laws could have done. I mean, yeah, they could have talked about me. They could have said things about me, but ultimately there's nothing they could have physically done to me other than probably what would have happened is honestly, because I do think they really do, did love me and want what was best for me. I honestly think if I had said, hey, I'm not comfortable talking about this, this is not a conversation for us to be having, I think they would have respected it. And, later on probably been like, hey, I'm sorry that got brought up. I'm sorry if your feelings, were hurt by that. But, at the time, I just didn't even know how to use my voice in that way. Now, for many of you, you will not have in-laws like that. If it had been with my own family, that would not have been the case. If I had been with my blood family, with my mother, and I had said, I don't want to have this conversation, you can bet she would have took that personally and been very upset and projected it out onto me. But I do think in the case of my in-laws, there would have been a different response. So we are learning as we go. It is a journey and a process, learning how to use our voice to protect our peace and learning how to let other people feel uncomfortable when they've overstepped boundaries. Okay, so with that first story shared, let's now dive into some of the common behaviors and ways that I see us showing up in people pleasing and codependency during the holidays. Okay, and we're heads up, like big, big, big. We are not coming to this from shame. We are just coming to this from awareness. I'm going to keep repeating that over and over, okay? This is not an episode for us to hold ourselves to a standard as much as it is to build awareness and then bring in some supportive ways of behaving differently that we may not even be thinking of. So first, and this is a big one that I did for many years, is agreeing to stay with in-laws even if it makes you feel trapped. So I definitely had this with my family. My mom wanted us to stay at their home. We did for many years. And looking back, we would have been so much better served by staying somewhere else, staying somewhere where we could get space from my siblings, from the rest of the family. I just never even thought that we could do that. That's going to sound so silly. But anybody who's been in a, very controlling, narcissistically run family knows that often staying somewhere else can be a personal affront to your narcissistic parent. So often we will end up staying in places where we are constantly exposed to our family. Maybe we don't have any space where we can get away and we deep down feel trapped, but we don't consider oh yeah, I'm an adult. We can stay in a hotel. We can stay in an Airbnb. So that's one of the biggest ones that we may not even have questioned yet of we don't actually have to stay with family during the holidays. There are other options available. Second is taking on too much. I'm talking about when we are agreeing to host, when we are cooking all of the meals, when we are maybe helping with childcare, all because, not necessarily because we want to or we feel resourced enough to, but because we feel like it's easier to do than saying no or drawing a boundary. Okay, this is, that overextending, over operating that I talk about, especially for those of us that are parentified as children. wanting to make everybody else feel good, so we're taking extra on our plate. Another one is avoiding alone time because it's going to force you to feel. So this is a sneaky one. This one isn't necessarily, I would think of, related so much to like the interactions with your family, your extended family during the holidays. But I do see this a lot when we are in the process of considering divorce. We can use the holiday period, which I think of normally from, Thanksgiving all the way through New Year's. It's that November, December 2-month period where we really are just putting on the mask, playing the role, and going with all of the activities, all of the things, without really acknowledging and checking in with how much we're doing that to avoid how we're feeling at the time. Now, like I'm going to keep saying throughout the whole episode, I get this. I do. Sometimes, it makes me think of how when I'm working with my clients, my one-on-one clients, we talk about buffering, right? How buffering is what we do when we want to avoid feelings. This is a common way that we buffer during the holidays, is just packing the schedule full, going. And so I want you to be gentle with yourself around this, because the holidays do tend to trigger a lot more emotions. So just noticing if you're doing this, okay? It's not that we have to change it. It's not that we have to get on ourselves and be like, okay, I need to be sitting with my feelings more, as much as just, okay, how much am I overscheduling? How much am I, where's, the next light show? Where's the next skating rink thing? Where's the next kids event? And even if you're just taking a little bit more space, maybe early in the mornings where you have some time by yourself, or asking for some time away, especially when you're with just your spouse and kids, that can be huge, because often, what's the cost, right? Behind our people pleasing and our codependency, it's an ongoing state of dysregulation in our body. We are never fully dropping down into safety with ourselves. So notice if you're finding yourself avoiding any alone time or time to resource yourself, because you find when you do, feelings come up. If they do, we're going to talk later about journaling. It is key for that. Now, some behaviors to look out for would be over-explaining yourself, as I just shared in my first story, right? Feeling this need to get everybody else on board with whatever you're doing. I did a lot of over-explaining in that 1 to 2 hour conversation. I mean, over-explaining about stuff that I wasn't even fully certain on, that was still very tender and like gentle and needed to be kind of protected and allowed to be digested and understood with people I trusted, or just with myself. I found myself in a wide open format and having to explain stuff that I wasn't even ready to understand and explain to myself. Okay, so notice over explaining, avoiding conflict by staying quiet or sugarcoating things. Y'all, I know we do this one a lot. And I would say if you're noticing this one for yourself, this is a pretty good indicator, especially if you're in the process of considering still. Like if you are having to go to holiday events and you are finding yourself not being able to be yourself, having to stay very quiet, or having to change or cover things up, it's just some really good intel for you to be taking into this decision of how far you may have to change yourself, from the person that you actually feel good as to the person that's palatable for your family or your in-laws. Another behavior is prioritizing everyone else's comfort over your own. Oh, do I see us doing this at the holidays? Especially when we feel like we need to hold it all together for our children. I feel like there is so much pressure around the holidays to make it magical and, inspirational. And we often, as women, especially as mothers, take on that burden. And we will push ourselves to extremes. I think of, the staying up late, making cookies or wrapping presents, or, really neglecting our self-care to try and make sure everybody else is having a magical experience and feeling comfortable while not checking in with what's going on for us. Also, feeling like the